There is a moment in the history of Kiss when the band stops looking like the unstoppable machine fans once believed it was. Not a dramatic explosion, not a screaming argument backstage, just a quiet realization. The realization that the band that once looked permanent was starting to fall apart. Peter Criss had already been pushed out in 1980 after years of internal tension. Ace Frehley, the original Spaceman, the guitarist whose solos had helped define the sound of Kiss, was drifting further and further away from the group. By the time the Creatures of the Night era began, Ace was still technically a member of the band. But behind the scenes, everyone already knew the truth. The original lineup was dying. And when Ace finally stepped away in 1982, Kiss faced a terrifying question. Who could possibly replace him? Ace Frehley wasn't just another guitarist. He was a founding member, one of the four faces that had built the mythology of Kiss. And suddenly, that face was gone. The band could have collapsed right there. In fact, many people in the music industry expected it to. By the early 1980s, Kiss was no longer the unstoppable juggernaut it had been just a few years earlier. The late 1970s had ended with internal fighting, creative disagreements, and declining momentum. The band had experimented with disco on Dynasty in 1979. They had taken an ambitious and controversial creative gamble with music from The Elder in 1981. But instead of reinventing the band, those experiments left Kiss in a strange position. They were no longer the hottest band in the world, and now their most iconic guitarist had walked away. So Gene Simmons and Paul Stanley did something that would quietly change the structure of Kiss forever. They decided the band would continue, even if the lineup didn't. And that decision opened the door to one of the most chaotic chapters in the history of the group. A chapter filled with new guitarists, new personalities, new conflicts, and the beginning of a pattern that would define the next decade of Kiss. Because once Ace Frehley left, the band didn't find stability. They found a revolving door, and the first man to walk through that door would become one of the most controversial figures in Kiss history. A guitarist who arrived with extraordinary talent. A musician who helped the band survive one of its darkest periods. And a man whose relationship with Gene Simmons and Paul Stanley would ultimately collapse in spectacular fashion. His name was Vinnie Vincent. To understand why Vinnie Vincent mattered so much to Kiss, you have to understand what the band was facing in 1982. The music world had changed dramatically since the glory days of Alive in 1975. Hard rock was evolving. Heavy metal was getting heavier. Bands like Iron Maiden, Judas Priest, and Van Halen were redefining what guitar-driven rock could sound like. Meanwhile, MTV had launched in August 1981, and suddenly, image and video were becoming just as important as sound. Kiss had always been masters of image, but the industry was moving faster than anyone expected. And by the time Kiss released Creatures of the Night on October 13, 1982, the band was in desperate need of a creative reset. The album itself would eventually be praised by fans and critics as one of the heaviest and most powerful records in the Kiss catalogue. Songs like War Machine, I Love It Loud, and the title track Creatures of the Night showed a band trying to reclaim its hard rock identity. But behind the scenes, the lineup was already shifting. Ace Frehley's involvement in the album was minimal. Most of the guitar work was performed by other players, including session musicians and outside contributors. And among those contributors was a relatively unknown guitarist who would soon step into the spotlight. Vincent Cusano. The world would soon know him as Vinnie Vincent. Vinnie Vincent did not walk into Kiss as a fully crowned replacement. His arrival was gradual. At first, he was simply a guitarist who had connections to the band's production circle. Vincent had already worked with producer Vinnie Vincent, who had been involved with Kiss recordings during the late 1970s. Through those connections, Vincent began contributing guitar parts during the Creatures of the Night sessions. His playing style immediately stood out. Fast, aggressive, technically explosive. Where Ace Frehley had always favoured melodic phrasing and blues-influenced solos, Vincent played with a sharp, almost shredding intensity. It was a sound that felt perfectly suited to the heavier direction Kiss was now pursuing. And Gene Simmons noticed. In fact, Simmons later credited Vincent as a major creative force during that period. Vincent even co-wrote several songs on the album, including I Love It Loud, one of the standout tracks from Creatures of the Night. For a band struggling to redefine itself, Vincent suddenly looked like the perfect solution. A fresh guitarist, a new personality, a new energy. And when Ace Frehley officially stepped away from the band in 1982, the choice became obvious. Vinnie Vincent would become the new lead guitarist of Kiss. But even from the beginning, the relationship was complicated, because Vincent wasn't joining Kiss as an equal partner. He was joining as a replacement, and that distinction would become incredibly important. The first real test came at the end of 1982. Kiss launched the Creatures of the Night / 10th anniversary tour in December. The band had something to prove. They needed to show fans that Kiss could survive the loss of a founding member. And on stage, Vinnie Vincent delivered. Night after night, he attacked the guitar with astonishing speed and technical skill. Fans who attended those shows often remember the shock of seeing someone new in the spaceman role. But they also remember something else: the sheer intensity of Vincent's playing. For Gene Simmons and Paul Stanley, that energy was exactly what the band needed. But the transition wasn't seamless. Vincent was never given the original spaceman makeup. Instead, he appeared in a redesigned persona called the Ankh Warrior. The character was mysterious and visually striking, but it also symbolized something deeper. Vinnie Vincent was part of Kiss, but he wasn't Ace Frehley, and that subtle difference would follow him throughout his time in the band. As the tour continued into 1983, something interesting started happening. Kiss was regaining momentum. The heavier sound of Creatures of the Night resonated with fans who had been waiting for the band to return to its hard rock roots. Vinnie Vincent's guitar work became a huge part of that energy. But success also created new tension. Vincent was an ambitious musician, and he wanted recognition. He wanted songwriting credit. He wanted financial participation. And most importantly, he wanted to be treated as a full member of the band. But Gene Simmons and Paul Stanley were cautious, because the band had already been burned by internal conflicts before. So while Vincent was allowed to perform and contribute creatively, his official status inside the band remained complicated. He wasn't quite a hired gun, but he wasn't a founding partner either. And the longer the relationship continued, the more those questions started to matter. By 1983, Kiss was preparing for the biggest reinvention in its history. On September 18th, 1983, the band appeared on MTV without their iconic makeup for the first time. The moment shocked fans. For nearly a decade, the makeup had been the defining visual symbol of Kiss. But the music industry was changing rapidly, and Gene Simmons and Paul Stanley believed the band needed a new identity. That same day, Kiss released the album Lick It Up. The record marked the beginning of the band's non-makeup era, and Vinnie Vincent's guitar work was everywhere on the album. His playing was aggressive, technical, and unmistakably modern. For a moment, it looked like Kiss had found its new formula. The band had survived the collapse of the original lineup. They had reinvented their image, and they had a new guitarist who seemed capable of driving the band into the future. But beneath the surface, the relationship between Vincent and the rest of the band was already beginning to crack. But as the Lick It Up tour roared on into 1984, the illusion finally cracked. From the outside, Kiss looked reborn. Bigger crowds, heavier riffs, a new face on MTV. From the inside, the truth was colder. Vinnie Vincent had done exactly what the band needed. He brought fire when the machine was stalling. He wrote hits when the well was running dry. He proved Kiss could survive without its founding guitarist. And for that, they would never forgive him. Because the moment he demanded to be treated as an equal, the rules changed. Contracts, credits, control. Gene Simmons and Paul Stanley had already decided the band could replace anyone, but the power at the centre would never be shared again. The guitarist who helped save Kiss was about to become its most expensive lesson. The screaming meetings, the shredded contracts, the night Vinnie Vincent realised the Ankh Warrior was never meant to last. This is where the revolving door started spinning full speed. This is where the original dream died for good. And this is where Gene and Paul quietly became the only two faces that would never leave. The fall of Vinnie Vincent isn't just another band drama. It's the moment Kiss stopped pretending to be a band and became something far more permanent. Part 2 drops next. Don't miss it. Because this is the story of how an unstoppable machine was rebuilt, one replacement at a time.